Hi everyone. This is the first of a two-part video giving you a walkthrough of how to use the platform called ArcGIS Story Maps for Project 2. In this first video, I'm going to walk you through some of the very basics of what we're aiming with this project and how to get started planning for your own story map. So, very first thing, what you're looking at right now on this screen is a completed story map as an example of what we're aiming for. And this particular one is linked on one of the links that I have for you on the Project 2 files folder on Blackboard. So when you read a little bit about how to use story maps to tell stories with place, this is one of the links that's on there. So you see what we're aiming for, and all of this can be customized. So there's a title, a subtitle, a background. When we scroll through, there's a map with some information about this locale. Notice that there's a specific link to where this image came from and a source. We'll talk more about this later. And we can keep scrolling to see other maps as we go through. And so this is basically what story map looks like. This is one version of it. I'll show you two versions in part 2 of this video. But basically what it does is it creates something that's something between a Google map and a PowerPoint presentation. So it'll facilitate how we convey our information for Project 2. It'll also look really nice and professional and give us a sense of why we would want to map out spaces when we read poetry. So to get started, another link you'll see on Blackboard is this link for resources, and the top of the page looks like this. And when you scroll down to the bottom, there's this section called Make Your First Story, and this is where we want to get started. This gives you a breakdown of how you want to plan for this project. So the very first thing that you want to do is to make a storyboard of sorts. You want to have a document like Google Docs, for instance, that has all the information that you want to include. So by the time you start putting your story map together, you already have everything ready and you can start copying and pasting information. So you start by planning, then you craft your narrative. You don't have to use Story Builder, but this is just here for in case you want to. We'll talk about maps in the next video. And then you get to also customize the design of your own presentation. So each presentation in the class will look unique in a certain way and will represent how you want your project to look and feel, and then we'll get to share. So the very first thing that we want to do then is begin with some research and with some notes. So you see I have several tabs open right here, and some of them are going to be really important for the work that we want to do. So the very first tab we want is where you're going to take your notes. So for instance, on Google Docs. And if you're doing this project collaboratively, obviously you want to share this file with someone that you're working with. The other tab you want open is the actual poem that we're studying by Whitney, which is The Manner of Her Will and What She Left to London and to All Those in It at Her Departing. This is the last poem on Whitney's collection, and as a lot of you already wrote about in past discussion boards, it kind of is her farewell to London, looking at everywhere that she's been and all the people that she's connected with, and thinking about her time in that city, and of course mourning some of the losses that she's had financially, personally, in terms of health and all the other things. So the first thing that you want to do for this project is to go back to this poem and close read it really carefully line by line to start marking up the places that she references. This will be a little difficult at first because you're not familiar with London, let alone early modern London. But there are some annotations on this particular student edition that will get you started. And you can also use the other tab that we have open here, which is the map of early modern London. So this particular website will give you information about several spots in early modern London, the London of Whitney's time, and will give you some background. The one thing to keep in mind also is that, as we've talked about, Whitney's spelling isn't always the spelling that we're used to, so it might take you a couple of tries to find the original place. So as we read, for instance, We might notice when Whitney makes reference to certain spaces. So, starting at line 25 or so, for instance, she says, I first to all of London leave, because I there was bred, brave buildings rare, of churches store, and Paul's to the head. Now, the editors of this collection tells us that Paul's is St. Paul's Cathedral. So we might take a look at what St. Paul's Cathedral was. And this is the example that I'm going to be following for the rest of this tutorial. So when I go to the map of early modern London and I search St. Paul's, I might already know that St. Paul's Cathedral and St. Paul's Churchyard are the same spot. And I might want to take a look at some of this information here in the history of St. Paul's and think about why Whitney starts by mentioning that particular spot, what it means for her, and especially what it means for the public of her time. Why is this particular spot so useful and so important, and what does it represent philosophically but also literally? What did people do in that place? Why was it important for that culture? And that's where we want to go. Let me go back to the poem. So as I begin to take my notes, I will start making annotations wherever you want to put them about these spots. So here's one, Paul's to the head. As I continue to read, I might look further down. Between the same fair streets there be, and people goodly store, because their keeping craveth cost, I yet will leave him more. First for their food I butchers leave, then every day shall kill. By Thames you shall have brewer's store, and bakers at your will. So by Thames we might figure is another space, and we might want to do some research of what that space is. And such as orders do observe, and eat fish thrice a week. Line 39, I leave 2 streets. So here's a suggestion for us that she's going to mention some other spots. Full fraught therewith, they need not far to seek. Watling Street and Canwick Street I full of woolen leave, and linen store in Friday Street if they not me deceive. So we'll keep going line by line and mark all of the places that Whitney mentions, and there are several. And so we'll want to take a look at where these places are and what they mean for Whitney, for her community at the time, and then for us now. Now, there are some footnotes on this poem that will help you get started, but I really want you to do some additional research and to find some information on your own to include in your map. So when you have all your annotations ready, you will choose the specific spots you want to feature on your project. Much like in Project 1, our goal is not just to point out that these places exist, but to make an argument about them. So pick places that you feel are most significant to the poem that help you make a specific argument about why Whitney is mentioning them and what value they carry for her community, for herself, for the space in which they are. You might think about how close together these places are, how far apart. Can someone actually walk from one of these places to another? What kinds of people live there? What kinds of interests do these people have? Why is Whitney writing about these places? So once you have all these places, you're going to go back to your storyboard and you're going to select the ones that you want to write about in depth for your project. So write down the name of the place, if it's a street or a locale that's mentioned. Begin your research. Now, this will be slightly tricky if you've never done this kind of research before, but not too difficult. As I mentioned, the first place you want to go to is the map of early modern London. That'll have most of the places that Whitney mentions. So you want to read all the information that Mo Emlo gives to you, and then you want to select the ones that are useful and either paraphrase or copy and quote directly. You can also search on Google and find what are these places now? What do they represent for our communities or for their communities now? If you want to dig even deeper, you might think about what comparable places do we have in New York that are community-based, and how might that be interesting for us? In your notes, you also want to have your interpretation of that place as mentioned in the poem. Why is it significant for Whitney, and why does it appear in the poem in the way that it does? And then you want to have some kind of illustration that connects us to that spot. So I've already done the search for St. Paul's Churchyard on Google, and I'm just going to call your attention to Tools, which is one of the buttons that appears once your search is completed. And we want to go to Usage Rights and select Creative Commons licenses. This means that we're only looking at images that we can actually freely use and reproduce. So you might pick a picture of a modern day St. Paul's, anyone that looks interesting to you. Or if you want, you might add early modern to your search and see if anything changes. These searches didn't quite change so much, but there are some older illustrations of Paul's. So pick the illustration that speaks most to you, that you think best references the spot as you see it or as you want to write about it. Once you've selected the image that you want to save this image on your computer. You also want to save the information about where it came from. So in the case here, this image is from Flickr from Payne State University Library. So we want to make sure that we cite them correctly. So save that to your computer, copy the link and the citation information onto your storyboard, and then move on to the next spot. And I'll stop this part right here just to get you thinking about how you're planning and researching for this project. The next video will go on to talk more specifically about how to place information on story maps and get started there.